Great. So hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Pick Your Partner Working with Digitization Vendors. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Biz Gallo, the statewide digitization coordinator for the Library of Michigan. Now, my job is to help libraries and cultural heritage organizations throughout Michigan digitize their collections, make them accessible, and preserve them over time. After laying the foundation for digitizing collections in last year's 9-part Digitization Basics webinar series, which you can view on YouTube, we're going to dive a little bit deeper this year in the How to Pick series, which will cover a variety of topics. For example, we'll have format-specific classes, such as digitizing newspapers, scrapbooks, and audiovisual material. Resource-centered classes, such as working with vendors, working with interns and volunteers, and building community archives, as well as procedural classes, such as writing grant applications and creating digital exhibits. As always, if there are particular topics that you're interested in learning more about related to digitization, please let me know so I can continue to provide you with the resources you need to create and care for your digital collections. Okay. So before we get started, I'd like to go over just a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so you can access the content again later, along with a copy of the slides. The recording should be available sometime next week, allowing time for captioning. If you've missed any of the classes in this series, you can always view the recordings by going to the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be Q&A at the end, but feel free to put questions in the chat throughout the webinar if you have them. And if you have any technical or audio issues, please reach out to Becky in the chat so that she can help resolve them. And last, you will receive a copy of the slides with links to all of the resources I'm going to discuss today, so you don't have to scramble to try to copy any of this down. You can always explore many additional resources on the digitization page of the Library of Michigan website. So today, we're going to be looking at a couple things. We'll be looking at factors to consider when determining whether to use a vendor, how to request quotes from a vendor, and how to ensure quality products from a vendor. But before we dive in, I'd like to start with a poll, as I always do. Okay, so the poll is, have you used a vendor for digitization in the past? Looks like most people have not. Some people have worked with a vendor before, but most people haven't. For those of you who have worked with a vendor in the past for a digitization project, do you want to go ahead and just drop in the chat what type of material you had digitized? Is it film, books, newspaper, yearbooks digitized, microfilm to CD, yearbooks and newspapers? Yeah. Well, whether you've worked with a vendor before or you're considering using one for the first time, we're going to go over the things that you can do to ensure a successful vendor experience. If you're planning a digitization project, you'll likely at least consider whether you'll digitize material in-house using your own staff and equipment, or whether you'll use a vendor. There are benefits and drawbacks to each, and you may use a combination of the two to complete your project, but there are several factors to consider when making this decision. You'll need to evaluate your resources and needs related to equipment, expertise, time, funds, and control. First, let's look at equipment. Digitization requires equipment, often expensive and specialized equipment, depending on the format of the media you're digitizing. Small, multi-purpose flatbed scanners can be purchased for just a few $100s, but large-scale overhead scanners can run tens of thousands of dollars or more. Now, there's not only the initial investment to consider, but for this type of equipment, you'll likely need a service contract or at least regular maintenance. Also, consider that technology changes and equipment will need to be replaced or upgraded every few years. Is that something that you want or need to bear the cost of, or would it be better to put those costs on the vendor? That is, if you can even get equipment. If you're planning to digitize audiovisual material, many are finding it more and more difficult to acquire playback devices, which are no longer being manufactured, and existing equipment is highly coveted to use as replacement parts. Even if you can purchase the quality level of equipment needed, it comes with a price tag to match. In addition to scanners or playback devices, you will need to acquire computers, hardware, software, and other material to manipulate and manage files. Now, perhaps you can digitize material, but would need to work with a vendor for digital collections hosting or digital preservation options. And while there are many free open source software options available, you may find that the time you save using a vendor or a vendor's proprietary or hosted options can save you more time and money in the long run. Next, consider not only that you must purchase this equipment, but you also must dedicate a space to it. Even smaller equipment requires some square footage, such as a tabletop and a processing space. A dedicated space is better, so you don't have to constantly set up and tear down equipment, which can damage equipment over time, though that may not always be possible. Depending on the type of material being digitized, you might also need a large area to organize and prepare material for digitization. Depending on the equipment or format, you may also need additional electrical, wiring, or soundproofing. There are also many recommendations and best practices for the color of the walls and lighting for various digitization lab setups. So the square footage isn't the only consideration when it comes to digitization equipment. Next, let's explore expertise. Any digitization project will require some level of expertise, either to digitize materials yourself or to know enough to ask a vendor for what you need and then be able to confirm that what you received is correct. Just because you don't currently have the experience needed, that doesn't mean that you can't use a digitization project as an opportunity to learn. As we've discussed before, digital collections building is incremental. You build on successes and make adjustments accordingly. Now, it's probably not advisable to jump into a large-scale digitization projects with no prior experience. It would be much better to start with a small, simple digitization project and build on your experience until you get to the needed level of expertise or to a level where it becomes necessary to use a vendor. There are also different levels of expertise required for different projects. Consider that you may have material that needs conservation before or during digitization, and it wouldn't make sense or it might even be impossible for you to do this work in-house. For example, perhaps you can digitize audio discs that you have in your collection that are in good condition overall, but you have one or two discs that are delaminating and can't be played without destroying the disc. You may need to send that to a vendor that can digitize the disc without a stylus contacting the disc surface. Now, would you use this method for all of your discs? Probably not, but there are certain situations that might arise where that level of expertise is required and it's beyond our capabilities to do in-house. Also, consider project management expertise. Most often, digitization is a small part of the overall process. You need project management expertise and infrastructure to perform quality control and management of the files over time. At the least, you would need to acquire these skills to be able to work with a vendor to complete the digitization project. Now, there are training opportunities available, like the Digitization Basics webinar series, among others that are freely available. Now, vendors are usually experts in their particular fields and have, or should have, years of experience in digitization, materials handling, and data management. This is especially important when working with unique, often fragile cultural heritage materials where content is irreplaceable. Digitization for cultural heritage preservation will require a different output than for standard business and access digitization. So ensure that the vendor's level of experience and expertise matches your project's needs. In addition to having the equipment and expertise needed to digitize material, often time can be a factor in deciding whether to use a vendor. If you are constrained by a fiscal year or a grant period to complete a digitization project, it can be difficult or impossible to complete a project in-house. If you don't have dedicated staff that focuses on digitization, what happens to their other tasks when they're working on a digitization project? Vendors usually have a specially designed production facility that enables them to work with greater efficiency and speed than most libraries are capable of. Vendors can hire or reassign staff to work on projects with shorter timeframes to make sure the deadlines are met. Alternatively, a vendor may have too many projects in production to meet your project's deadline, so you may have to work with an alternate vendor or find a way to do the project in-house within your timeline. You may also not have staff time available to prepare material to send to a vendor or manage a vendor project. If you can only dedicate time to a digitization project sporadically, it's likely not feasible to use a vendor, which would require dedicating resources on given timelines in order to meet any sort of contract requirements. Last, consider not only the time it takes to do the project, but also time as a factor for material that is obsolete or deteriorating and needs to have immediate conservation or digitization in order to be preserved. Can you wait to digitize until you've acquired the skills and equipment necessary to digitize? Digitization costs money, period. But whether you're digitizing in-house or using a vendor, it's going to cost money. If you use a vendor, it's a lot easier to put a price tag on digitization, usually down to the cost per item. But you might not have the funds to hire a vendor and can only digitize using staff, interns, or volunteers. If you're using interns, you should be paying them. If you're using volunteers, you still need to account for your time to oversee them and the process. If you digitize in-house, there is still that cost. You need to pay your staff to acquire the expertise and digitize the material. Vendors often have a lower labor cost than cultural heritage organizations. Now, this isn't to say that vendors don't pay their employees fair and livable wages, but the efficiency of their workflows, the speed of post-processing automation, and quality of the equipment that they use can often produce faster results than non-vendored setups. If you wanted to compare, you could always do an in-house pilot and do a cost analysis for how much the full project would take to take with your level of staff. If you don't have the ability to do that sort of test sample batch, you can always use the DLF Digitization Cost Calculator, which is a tool that will help you estimate the amount of time and money it will take to do the work, from preparing material to scanning to performing quality control and generating metadata. Also consider when you're building out this time that if there are any mistakes, if you use a vendor, the cost to correct them is incurred by the vendor, not your staff. Where if you make mistakes when you're digitizing in-house, you still have to pay to redo those mistakes. Last, depending on what your funding source is, you may not have a choice except to use a vendor. Some grants, such as CLEAR's Recordings at Risk grant, require applicants to work with a qualified external service provider. Last, you'll need to identify the level of control you want to have over the process. If you are digitizing in-house, you can control every aspect of the process. Alternatively, using a vendor is often considered a black box model. Material goes into a system that you can't see into and essentially have no control over what happens inside. Materials handling, technical processes, and quality standards are outside of our control. On the other hand, we get a product and our original materials back, but how that process occurs is opaque. This is, of course, one of the most important reasons to work with a vendor you trust if you are going to use a vendor. Take the opportunity to tour the vendor facilities if it's possible. Get a sense for their environment, their staff, and their workflows. Most vendors should be open to you touring the facilities if you are planning to work with them. Now, there's often a desire to let vendors handle everything. And sometimes they can do everything from picking up material to digitizing it, describing it, hosting it, and digitally preserving it. And depending on your situation, this might be the most appropriate path to take. But please, if you do, ensure that you always get a copy of your files and that the files are not in a proprietary format that you cannot access outside of the vendor system. Also, consider that if you are shipping material to a vendor, you don't have control over the material while it's in transit, which can be problematic for some people. You can make decisions and put it into your contract or have discussions with vendors about how material will be shipped or transported. You can use a courier service or hand delivery. You could even ask vendors to digitize on site, depending on the type of material. In the end, there is not going to be a right or a wrong answer. There is going to be a more appropriate choice for your particular project at your particular institution with your particular resources. Now, as you undertake more and more digitization projects, it's likely that you'll use some combination of in-house and vendor services. Remember, things to consider are, can you digitize with the equipment you have in-house? Equipment is expensive, not just the initial purchase. Does staff have the expertise or can get the expertise necessary to digitize your material? Vendors are usually already experts in this field. Does your staff have the time to digitize? You may be limited by grant or fiscal years. Do you have the funding to hire a vendor? Remember, even if you're not paying a vendor, there is still a cost to digitize material. And how much control do you want or need over the process? Working with a vendor gives you less control over the work that happens compared to digitizing in-house. In the end, you will need to decide which option is not only most cost-effective, but also fits within your organization's comfort level. So looking at some examples, if you are digitizing a large-scale project of common formats like documents or photographs, and your staff has the training and bandwidth to do it, it's probably more cost-effective to purchase the equipment and do it in-house. If you have a few specialized formats that would require a substantial financial investment to digitize, it might just be cheaper and easier to send it out to a vendor. Do you want to drop in the chat anything that you might think of would be a good thing to send to a vendor? Any sort of projects either that you've done in the past or projects that maybe you're thinking of having digitized? Heidi says that we sent nitrate film to NEDCC for reformatting, which required hazmat shipping. Luckily, MSU Logistics helped us ship through because they are certified. Yes, excellent. Yeah. Material that has special requirements like nitrate film, whether it's motion picture film or still image film, definitely worth using a vendor that's qualified to handle that kind of material. I know a couple people mentioned newspapers, either microfilm or large format material. Those are things that are really hard to, just by virtue of their format, digitize in-house. Okay, let's move on. So once you've decided to use a vendor for a digitization project, the next step is to select which vendor. This will depend on many factors, such as the vendor's location, the cost, their capabilities, and the quality of their work. One of the best ways to do this is to request a quote or a proposal from vendors. You can either make a request for a proposal, also called an RFP, or you could reach out to specific vendors for quotes. Now, if this is your first digitization project or your first time speaking with a particular vendor, it's worth a phone call or a meeting to discuss the project, your needs, and the vendor's capabilities. Look for vendors that routinely work with cultural heritage institutions compared to mass consumer style digitization vendors. These vendors will understand not only the importance of the physical material, but also will be aware of standards and best practices when it comes to digitization. Now, if you don't know who to contact, there are many resources available to help point you in the right direction. You can reach out to listservs like Mish Libel, can explore aggregated vendor lists like No Reservation Recommendations and DLF's vendor registry, or by reaching out directly to colleagues for suggestions. This can often be the best way to identify potential vendors, as your colleagues can give you a first-hand account of their experiences. Colleagues are unlikely to recommend vendors with whom they've had negative experiences and can flag any particular issues that they've encountered in similar projects. Now, depending on the size of your project, you might not need something as formal as an RFP, and instead may only reach out to a few potential vendors with some of the basic information. At a minimum, you should provide the format to be digitized, the number of items or amount of material to be digitized, your desired deliverables, including any technical specifications that you have, a timeline or any time constraints that you're working with, as well as any other pertinent information. Now, if you're requesting an estimate to include in a grant application, be sure to tell your vendor, because qualified vendors will likely already have experience in preparing quotes for grant proposals and will know what grant reviewers are looking for and may be able to provide additional details or recommendations for your proposal. RFPs are usually reserved for large projects, or you could be required to have an RFP by your administration. If you do put out an RFP, there are plenty of sample RFPs available online that can be tweaked to fit your specific project, so please don't start from scratch. It's a lot of work. In Northeast Document Conservation Center, or NEDCC's preservation leaflet on outsourcing and vendor relations, Robin Dale lists the elements to include in an RFP. An RFP should include a brief description of the nature of the project and services being outsourced, a description of the nature of materials the vendor will receive. Are they getting documents or audio tapes? What are they receiving? Any sort of technical specifications that you have in mind. So, in our last How to Pick series, we talked about how to select your file formats and resolution specifications, bit depths, things like that. So if you have any sort of conversion requirements or targets, you should include that. Any sort of standards that you will be that you're trying to meet. So let's say that you are hoping for, FADGI 3-star, you want to include that. If you have specific file mats that you want produced, especially if it's something that's not a standard or a best practices format, definitely something that you want to specify. And then also if you have any specific delivery medium. So are you going to want files on a hard drive? Are you going to want it written to LTO tape? Do you need it transferred via FTP? Those are the kinds of specifications you're going to want to include. You'll also want to include any sort of procedural requirements that you have. So especially with archival or cultural heritage material, you'll probably have some handling requirements, like no food or drink around the material, possibly wearing gloves for certain material, that sort of thing. You'll also have, if you have any sort of billing requirements, like, you need a vendor to get set up in your system in order to pay them. Or if you have, 90 days payment or something that might not be quite normal, make sure you put that in there so that you are giving as much information as possible to the vendor. Same thing if you have any managerial requirements. Do you have communication protocols that need to be in place? You want to be pushing this information to the vendor as soon as possible. Next is any project timelines. This is also going to be really important, especially if it's a large project or if there are any sort of deadlines that they need to be aware of, because there might be rush fees. You also want to include any sort of security, storage, insurance, and bonding requirements, especially if you have maybe moldy material or audiovisual material. You'll want your material to be in cold storage while it's in the vendor's care, making sure that they can properly care for the material while it's in their possession. Same thing with security. What's their security like? Are your materials, which are likely irreplaceable, going to be safe and secure? And then finally, information about how the RFP process or responses are going to be evaluated. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. So again, the more details you can provide, the more accurate of a proposal the vendor is going to be able to give you back. So that's what you're giving to the vendor, and what you're going to ask for in response is a whole list of things. And that way, when you're comparing things, you can compare everything equally. So you're going to want the names of the hardware and the software that they're going to use in the conversion, because you want to make sure that they're using the right equipment, and equipment that is capable of meeting your targets. You also want to have them talk about their specifications related to quality control procedures. Like, how do they verify that what they are doing is correct and complete? You'll also want to make sure that they can describe their production capacity so that you can ensure, especially if it's a large project, that they can actually meet the quality and timelines laid out in your RFP. You'll also want them to talk about how they're going to deliver both materials to you and files. Is it something that's going to be shipped? Are they going to pick it up and drop it off? How is that all going to work? Because there might be additional costs associated with different options. So you'll definitely want to know what is included in terms of shipping, courier services, those sorts of things. You'll also want a description of their environmental controls in their facility, especially, as I mentioned again, if you have moldy or if you have audiovisual material that needs to be temperature controlled more stringently, that's something, they should be able to give you readouts from their PEM monitors over the last year and just be able to verify that they do have control over their facility. Also, name and qualifications of the project manager. I'll say at least the project manager. It is not overstepping to ask for CVs for the project manager and maybe any other leads that might be working on your project if there's several different formats or aspects to it. You'll also definitely be asking for references for similar work done at other libraries, archives, and museums. We'll talk again about references in a minute. But wait, there's more. You may also ask for a submission of a sample that represents the type of material that you're requesting being digitized. We'll talk a little bit about pilots later on, but this might be an opportunity for you to do a pilot with multiple vendors. You will want a price proposal. Not only will you want a price proposal, you want to know, obviously how much you think this is going to cost, but you'll want those prices to be in specified units of measurement. So is this per page, per item, per minute? And how are they coming up with this number and how accurate do you feel like that number is? You'll also want them to include whether any sort of additional services, what those costs are. And those might be things that you may or may not use, but you would want to know what the cost would be ahead of time. So is this, storage or delivery or shipping or anything like that? You would want them to list whatever additional charges there might be, even if you don't end up using them. And then also whether or not the prices are firm for the duration of the project. So a lot of times you may have an umbrella contract with a vendor, and that might only be good for one fiscal year. If you have a really large project or you're using the same vendor for another project, prices might change. So that's something you really want to just make sure that you're on the same page about with the vendor. And then last, suggestions for alternative methods so that you can get the same results or even better results if they have suggestions. And again, we'll talk about that in another minute. So Dale recommends that organizations distributing RFPs budget 4 to 8 weeks for a response. So consider that if you're requesting quotes around the end of a fiscal year or to use fiscal year money, or if you're going to be using this in a grant proposal, there are probably a lot of other organizations that are doing the same thing. So you want to give both yourself and the vendor plenty of time to prepare a thoughtful, accurate proposal and to ensure that you have enough time to review that proposal, ask any questions of the vendor, and include your final decision in your grant application. So also, final note just about RFPs, be sure to include a contact person if the vendor has questions about the RFPs or if they just need clarification. Now, if they ask things that are probably relevant to the rest of the vendors that are also putting an application or putting in a proposal, it's a really good idea to just send out to everybody what the question was and what the answer is so that everyone is working with the same information and that you're able to compare things appropriately. So if you are using a vendor, they are hopefully an expert and can recommend additional or possibly even different deliverables to what you may have originally envisioned for your project. So you may find that when you are looking through proposals, you see, either additional or different things quoted than what you had initially asked for. If this is the case and you decide that this is something you would want instead, it's wise to ask the other vendors to either update their proposals or ask if they can also provide those products and services so that when you're looking at all of your proposals, you can compare apples to apples. This is also important when you're looking at services that may be included or may be an additional cost. So if you're looking at one vendor and they have things that are included and you're comparing it to another vendor that can also do those services, but theirs is an additional cost, you'll be able to weigh those against each other. So this is going to be really important when you're looking at things like conservation work, knowing what's included. Is some included? How much is included? How much is it going to cost? What if I go beyond that? Like, what's the process for getting this kind of work approved? These are all things that the vendor should have in their quote. These are all things that you should be very comfortable talking with your vendor about. It's also really important to not make assumptions because vendors can vary widely when it comes to this sort of conservation work or additional work. So it's important to understand upfront if and how this work would be charged for, especially when you're working with fragile, deteriorating material. So depending on your project, we talked about what things are included, maybe what things might be additional services. A lot of times vendors can do kind of this a la carte style of services. So let's just take a quick look at some of the additional services you might receive or want to receive from a vendor. So initially thinking about it, originals material prep. So services like conservation work. If you're dealing with paper, this is going to be things like deacidification or repairing tears in paper. If you are digitizing newspaper, they may have to be disbound if they are in bound volumes. If you have photographs, a lot of times, or photographic negatives, there may be mold or dirt that need to be cleaned before they can be digitized. If you have audiovisual material, especially magnetic material, those often suffer from what's called sticky shed syndrome. And so those tapes need to be baked before they can be digitized. Thinking about, are any of these included? And if they're not, how much do they cost if they're needed? Those sorts of things. I'm also going to put rehousing under this heading. That could be a new folder or new boxes or new reels. But digitization is a great time to rehouse your material if it needs it, because you're already going to be handling material one at a time. And so you're reducing the overall handling. If you can take something out, digitize it, put it in a new folder or a new box, it's going to be a lot cheaper than if you had to do it outside of this workflow. If you do get anything rehoused, just be sure to talk to your vendor and specify, how and where you want things labeled and whether or not you want the original housing back. So those are things you don't think about until you forgot to ask for those things back. Obviously, digitization services for a variety of different formats. Intellectual control. You might also ask vendors to do a lot with metadata, whether they're creating bibliographic records or they're embedding descriptive or technical metadata into the files or producing, METs or, various XML file formats for the material that they've digitized. Those can often be things that are included automatically or things that you need to work with them to request and specify. Also consider whether or not the vendor provides item level conditioning or condition reporting. So these would be things like documenting things about the material. These are usually more for objects or audiovisual material, that sort of thing, where you're talking about like films shrinkage or if there's damage to the material. But it could also be things like blank pages or things that are cut off, things that you wouldn't know unless you looked at the original object, but you don't want to go back and look at the original object. You're hoping that the vendor will push that information to you. When you're requesting, when you're putting in your RFP, you can often ask for a sample if they do any sort of item level condition reporting to be included in that. And that gives you kind of an idea for the type of documentation you'll get back. And if that's sufficient, if it's the right information, but you want it in a different format, usually vendors can work with you based on what your needs are. Next is quality control. Hopefully all vendors will be doing some form of quality control, but you might request or require additional levels of quality control. So, vendors are probably going to check everything at a certain point, but maybe not every single thing with every single checkbox. So if you need more or want more than that, that's definitely something that vendors will talk to you about. It's probably going to be cost prohibitive, but if it's something that you need or want, especially with specific material, it's something to talk about. There's also going to be the opportunity for additional file processing. So if you're doing textual material, you might request optical character recognition, or you might request, handwritten text transcription, transcription of audiovisual materials, that sort of thing. You might ask for some encoding services or derivative creation. So, we talked about how preservation files are great and that's the target, but they're not great for users. So you're going to need some use files, but you might not want standard use files, or you might have a particular need for your use files. So making sure you talk to your vendor about what you specifically need for your derivatives is going to be really helpful to make sure that those needs are met. You can also ask about digital hosting services or digital preservation services. So a lot of times with newspaper digitization, vendors will host your newspapers and provide access to them online. This could be a really good option for libraries or organizations that can't otherwise provide hosting access. There's also digital preservation services that they might be able to offer. Again, if you select either of these two services when working with a vendor, please get a copy of your files and make sure that you have a copy. And if anything ever happens to that vendor, you still have access to your material. So when you're looking at your proposals that you've received and if you have any questions, just ask the vendor. It's probably just a point of clarification or something that could easily be adjusted in the proposal or the final contract. If this is your first experience working with a digitization vendor, you might also want to consider reaching out to a knowledgeable or more experienced colleague to help review the proposals with you. So they might have insights from their own experiences with similar projects. So they might see some red flags in these proposals that you might miss, or you might notice some omissions that you can address before you select a vendor. Now, while it might be easier to select the cheapest option, that might not be the best fit for your project overall. If a proposal is way under or way over the amount of the other proposals you've received, it's likely that that vendor either doesn't have the ability to perform the job or they just don't understand what's being asked of them. Either way, this is not a vendor that you want to use. You can always go to them and ask for clarification and say, hi, we received a bunch of quotes and you are way over or way under. Can you explain this? And they might be able to. There might be a reason or a misunderstanding about what the requirements are, but definitely consider that as a red flag. If it's way under or way over, vendors talk to each other. They know what the going rate is. It should be pretty middle of the road when you're looking at costs. Yeah. So again, cost will always be a factor, but it shouldn't be the only factor when you're selecting a vendor. The research library group's requests for proposal guidelines recommend that institutions carefully establish criteria and a weighting of factors when you're evaluating proposals. And this is going to help you be more objective in your assessment. So the factors that they recommend evaluating proposals on are your understanding of and compliance with the RFP requirements. Did they understand it and can they do it? The excellence of the response. Did they take the time and provide you with something that is comprehensive and seems like they actually know what they're doing? If they've successfully processed a sample or test set of materials, you can choose to do a test batch or not, depending on the project. You may also choose to do a pilot with a bunch of different vendors. Their ability to meet the technical and managerial requirements. Do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the equipment? Their ability to meet the production schedule within your required timetable. Can they actually do it in the time frame allotted? Is the pricing fair and relative to the other proposals? So again, is this within the middle of the pack, or are they super cheap, or are they charging an arm and a leg? Again, looking at the qualifications and experience of their staff, especially ones that have worked on similar projects. Usually when you are working with vendors, if it's a large enough operation, they will have teams, and those teams usually work with similar types of materials, similar types of projects, so they're really familiar with this type of work. You want to make sure that they have the infrastructure needed and their systems are able to handle this material. You want to verify and compare their references. You want them to be able to guarantee of the work. Like, what are the guarantees? What are the warranties on their work? Depending on the size of the project, you'll probably want to also look at the financial stability of their business. So is this a new business that may not be around by the time you send your materials to them? Or is this something that's an established business that has a lot of clients, has a lot of throughput, and is somewhere that you're going to be able to establish a relationship with over the next few years? And then also just the nature and extent of the vendor support. So what are they able to provide to you? Are they able to help you? Or is it, here's your files, good day? This is something that, again, you're going to want to build that relationship over, and you're going to want to be able to choose a vendor that you can get support from over time. Now, as you go through and you're evaluating your proposals on this information, make sure that you document your evaluation for each proposal so that you have that documentation to support your ultimate selection, both to your procurement office and possibly to unsuccessful bidders. Okay. I do want to add some additional notes regarding timelines. We discussed earlier how timelines can have an impact on your decision about whether to use a vendor, and that you should include any relevant deadlines in your RFP and your eventual contact with the vendor. You should also consider that timelines can be affected by when the project actually begins. So vendors plan their production schedules in advance, and they do this to maximize equipment and their personnel resources. But they're also doing it to ensure that they can meet other clients' deadlines. So you need to be fair in your expectations of the vendor. So if you don't deliver your material in the timeline you said you would deliver it on in your contract, you might lose your spot in the production queue and in the end not be able to meet your own deadline. So this is especially important if you have fiscal year requirements. The other organizations that are having their materials digitized likely also have those same fiscal year requirements. So vendors can be incredibly busy at certain times of the year. Now, if there are unavoidable delays, as you know, there always are, just make sure that you communicate with your vendor as soon as possible so that they can make adjustments to their own production schedule. Just as you count on the vendor to complete a project by its due date, you're expected to deliver materials to a vendor in order to make that possible. Now, these production schedule issues could be exacerbated if you're working with a smaller vendor that has a less capacity to fit projects in as they come up. So again, this is one of those points where you're looking at their business model. Are they a large enough organization to be able to meet their demands? Okay. Finally, any vendor that you're considering working with should be able to supply you with the contact information for at least 3 former clients. Now, you're going to want to ask for references for projects that are the similar size as your project and digitizing similar materials. Now, preferably, these references are going to be from the similar organizational size and type as your own. It might not be, but you're going to want to get as close as possible from the vendor, because a large governmental agency is going to have a very different experience at every step of the process as a small historical society. And you want to ensure that that vendor is capable of working with you and that they understand your organizational needs. Just be sure that you actually contact the references provided, because references are not always good references. And it's important to call and make sure, or reach out to them and make sure that you get the answers that you need before selecting a vendor. Okay. So once you've selected a vendor, you can ensure the quality is met by having a contract in place that clearly lays out the responsibilities on both sides. Now, most vendors will already have a contract or a statement of work that they can provide, but your procurement office may have their own contract for the vendor to sign instead, or make adjustments to the vendor's contract. Remember, you are also beholden to this contract. Now, this contract should distill everything that you decided on or discussed at the RFP or proposal stage. So that's, your technical specifications, timelines, quality levels, costs, all of that should make its way into the contract. Now, the good news is that one of the benefits of working with a vendor is you get to expect a lot more from a vendor than you would if you were digitizing in-house. I mean, this is one of the main reasons to use a vendor, is that you get to hold them to standards of quality and performance that might be impossible if you were digitizing using your own staff and equipment. Before you jump into the full project, if you've attended any of my webinars, this will be a familiar concept. You're going to want to do a pilot. Now, in some cases, you might even do it before you select a vendor. Depending on the size and complexity of the project, you can pilot, do a pilot with multiple vendors to compare results. Depending on the vendor and the amount of work being done, you may have to pay for a pilot, or the vendor might include a pilot at no charge. It really just depends. But even if you have to pay for the pilot, it's worth the cost to ensure the success of the full project. So when you do a pilot, not only are you testing the vendor's ability to deliver files according to your specifications, but also the overall experience of working with that vendor. How's their communication? How's their reporting? Did they find anything unexpected that's going to affect the full project? Were the files delivered according to your specifications? Can you use the files you received? You can also use the pilot to receive several different deliverables and narrow down your selection to what you actually want for the full project. For example, if you're considering using a losslessly compressed preservation file format, request samples to test within your own system before making a final decision. This way, you can ensure that what you request is something that you can actually use. You can also use the opportunity to make changes to the project's deliverables and scope if you determine that what you asked for isn't what you actually need. Repeat the pilot if there are significant changes to deliverables or scope. You can repeat the pilot as many times as necessary to get it right. If you complete a pilot project and there are multiple issues that can't be resolved, it's okay to walk away from working with that vendor. Now, you want to give your vendor the opportunity to fix any mistakes or to attempt to remedy the situation. But in the end, if that isn't possible, you can cancel the project after the pilot or choose a different vendor. That is okay. That is the point of a pilot. Now, if you have a particularly large project, or if the project will take place over a several month or several year period, consider developing a batch-based schedule of file delivery. So vendors usually provide, on average, a 30-day review period for files, and that's whether you're receiving 5 files or 5,000 files. So by receiving regular batches of files, you can manage your own resources to be able to review files thoroughly while also providing regular feedback to the vendor. Now, you would not want to receive 5,000 files at the end of a year-long project and realize that the specifications were all wrong. Conversely, digitizing in batches can have an impact on the cost of a project. Digitizing 10 batches of 10 boxes is a lot different in a production workflow than digitizing 100 boxes. It's the same amount of boxes, but the workflow is very different. Larger projects usually come with a lower per item cost as the materials handling and project management for those materials is reduced because it's spread over all those materials. So try to aggregate material into a single large project rather than sending batches if possible. In the pilot project, at least, you should be checking 100% of the files you receive. While during the full project, you'll likely pick some subset of files or parameters to fully check. At this point, you need to check everything. You are probably not going to check everything for the whole project, and that's kind of why you're using a vendor, right? You're ensuring that they are checking their work, but you will need to determine what you're going to check and how much. It can be really overwhelming to know where to start when you're faced with a hard drive or a directory worth of files. But the fastest that you do check should be a balance of both objective, such as file names, file deliverables matching your specifications, and subjective, such as whether the quality is sufficient and whether the content matches the metadata. Now, depending on the size of your project, you may also want to utilize some automated tools to help with QC, but this is a fairly manual process. Now, it's important to test the files in your own systems. Many preservation files are large, uncompressed, and may require additional tools to open or play them back. So be sure that you can open the files and play them back or view them. Now, quality control tasks may need to be undertaken by multiple staff members, depending on what is being reviewed. Staff members closest to the collections may be better suited to review the content and the subjective aspects, while other staffs could be employed to review the technical specifications. After successful pilot projects, organizations will often only check a subset of the files unless they find many issues and those require a closer inspection. Now, if you find item-specific issues like incorrect content, a blurry image, a missing file, wait and aggregate all of those into a single feedback document. If there's an overarching problem with the files, like an incorrect file naming schema or folder nesting schema, or the format is wrong. Let the vendor know right away so that they can make adjustments to their workflow and processes immediately. So ideally, once a project is past the pilot phase and any issues have been resolved, the rest of the project should run smoothly. Now, hopefully you've selected a vendor that has experience and can deliver files correctly and efficiently, making the quality review process an easy lift. Remember, you're not just selecting a vendor, you're selecting a partner with which to do this work. They want to do a good job so that you're happy and that you return to them in the future with more business and recommend them to colleagues. You want them to do a good job so that you can focus your energies on the many, many other components of a digitization project beyond the digital capture. Okay, that is a lot for today. I just want you to remember a couple key takeaways. Whether you use a vendor will depend on your organization's resources and constraints. Make sure that you choose a vendor that works with cultural heritage organizations and that they understand the material and the mission of your organization. Be as objective as possible when you're evaluating proposals. The lowest cost is not always the best value to your organization. Pilots are essential for confirming you get what you asked for, and what you asked for is what you need. And finally, vendors are partners in this process. Building a relationship on trust is essential, and it goes both ways. Great. So that is all, but I have a few minutes left for questions. If you have any, feel free to either unmute yourself or to put them in the chat. I'm happy to talk. I answered all of your questions about vendors. This is wonderful. Okay. Well, if you have no questions, I will just take a minute to tell you about the next webinar in this series. The next class is how to pick your project, preparing for an audiovisual digitization project. I'll be joined by Sarah Mainville, who is the Media Preservation Librarian at Michigan State University Libraries. And she's going to discuss how to correctly identify and describe audiovisual material in your collection, how to safely store your audiovisual collection materials, and explore different avenues for funding audiovisual digitization projects. So that's going to be on October 24th at 1 p.m. Now, I just want to say thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this possible. Thank you all for joining me today. Becky's going to drop a link to the survey. Please take the time to fill it out. It's super short. It's just 5 questions, and this will help me improve my programming. It'll help us improve the library's programming. So I really appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. I will hang out for a while in case anyone has any more questions, but otherwise, thank you so much for joining me today.